Hi class, it's Brittany. This is week 6 discussion for chapter 6. The first question asks, describe the two basic components of oppositional culture thesis. To what extent do you find this explanation for achievement gap persuasive? In making your case, cite at least two empirical findings and theoretical criticisms that were discussed in chapter 6. So my response is the two basic components of the oppositional thesis are that one, African American students reject an educational environment out of fear of acting white, and two, that African American students rebel against conforming to the education institutions out of resentment of prior discrimination experience. The text note these two components on page 154, where it states, African American children do not do well in school because they equate school success with acting white. And it also states the second component as African American children have responded to widespread discrimination by developing an identity in opposition to dominant white culture. I did not find this argument all that persuasive, considering all the prior material within this text that was presented to us. So it wasn't a persuading argument. However, I do see how it could be persuasive. And then I continue to write. It is well known that our society has continued history of both practicing and belief of racism. Therefore, it makes sense to assume that African American children are resisting perceived white culture associated with the education institution. And the three empirical findings that would support the argument of the oppositional thesis being holding true would be, sorry, I lost where I was reading from. Oh, here we go. So the three empirical findings Fordham and Ogbu noted can be found on page 154. The first finding being that black children receive signals from both white and black communities that lead them to reject schooling. The second being that black students and their parents' experience with discrimination led them to distrust white authority figures and institutions. And third being that black students develop anti-achievement attitudes to avoid peer sanctions. And although these appear to be accurate assumptions, there's a few theories which counter the oppositional culture thesis. The first being the Darnell and Downey study of 17,000 students opposed to Fordham and Ogbu's 33 student study. Their findings can be noted on page 155, where it states black students had more positive attitudes towards school than white students, and black students reported being more popular when they did better in school. Tyson was the second study noted which criticized Ogbu's and Fordham's oppositional thesis. On page 155, the author states that these studies' findings of a 72 student sample to be black 3rd and 4th graders were consistently very excited about school and learning. So that's my answer for number 1. Okay, number 2. Define symbolic violence. Provide a specific real-life example of symbolic violence and explain how it contributes to the reproduction of racial inequality in the educational system. Use the main text to support your response. So, symbolic violence I defined as the case of a dominant culture creating a social environment where their culture is thought to be superior over all other cultures. It is defined on the book on page 155. Here we go. On page 155 as That is not one page. It is not defined on page 55, excuse me. It is defined on page 58. So, as the dominant group creates, symbolic violence as the dominant group creates a context in which the norms, values, and tastes of other groups are labeled as inferior. So, as you can see, here I should say, my definition is similar to the books and is supported by the books. It contributes to the reproduction of racial inequality within the education system because the white culture is dominant and is given superiority over all other cultures. This claim is supported on page 158, and it states an example of symbolic violence in the United States is the idea that the standard form of English spoken by middle-class white Americans is an indication of intelligence and eloquence, whereas the forms of English the working-class African Americans speak to one another is an indication of ignorance. A real-life example of symbolic violence I have experienced firsthand was at the DOL this summer while I was waiting to renew my license. A Latina woman whom spoke little English was refused service until she had an interpreter. The DOL worker shouted at the lady that we speak English in this country. This example indicated the DOL worker thought of her culture to be superior over the Latina woman since she was unwilling to even try to communicate with the woman and telling her that her language was not superior in the United States. So thank you. I can't wait to hear your guys' responses.